Acha. Good afternoon, everybody. Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. Let us begin with today's class. So, in the last class, I think we were talking about energy resources. In the last class, we were talking about energy resources and we talked about biomass energy. Uh, we also talked about some of the non-renewable energy sources like coal, petroleum, natural gas, nuclear energy, etc. Now, in this class, we will begin our discussion with land resources. We'll begin our discussion with land resources, and this is the last topic. Then the chapter on resources will be over. Now, if we think of land as a resource, then remember land is a very finite and valuable resource. And this land resource, which is pretty much a finite and valuable resource, it is on this resource that we depend for our food, for our fuel wood, for our fiber, for our developmental activities, etc. etc. So, land is pretty much a finite resource on which we largely depend for our food, our fiber, our fuel requirements, our developmental activities, etc. etc. And in this land resource, the resource about which we are specifically interested is the soil, is the soil. And soil, if we are talking about the soil, we are particularly interested in the topsoil. We are particularly interested in the topsoil, that is the top 15 to 20 centimeters of the soil, because majority of the fertility is retained in this topsoil. And we already know that this process of fertile topsoil formation takes several years. So, as far as statistics are concerned, to form about 2.5 centimeter of topsoil, to form about 2.5 centimeter of topsoil, it can take up to say 1000 years. It can take up to 1000 years. So, the process of fertile soil formation is a very slow process. It's a very slow process, but the process of soil erosion or soil degradation is pretty much a rapid process. Is pretty much a rapid process. So let us see what are the reasons for our land degradation, what are the reasons for our soil erosion, etc. etc. So we know that in our modern times, the population is growing, the human population is growing or increasing tremendously. And to feed this growing population, we need more and more arable land. So, arable land is needed for feeding this population. Also, we need land for producing more fiber, that is, clothing materials, packing materials. We also need a lot of fuel wood. So, the pressure on this finite land resource is increasing tremendously by the day because of the ever increasing and the ever expanding population. So, what man is doing presently, he is over exploiting the land resource. So, once you begin to over exploit a particular resource, it is quite obvious that the resource quality and the resource quantity is going to deteriorate. So, it is quite obvious that due to over exploitation, the resource quality and the resource quantity is going to deteriorate. And as far as the effects are concerned, soil degradation or the soil quality degradation is one of the major effects that we are suffering from. And very surprisingly, if we talk of the annual soil erosion rate, the soil is getting eroded about say 20 to 100 times faster than its renewal rate. So this is something very alarming. That is, soil is getting eroded about 20 to 100 times faster than its renewal rate. Associated with it is the problem of soil erosion, the problem of over irrigation of the agricultural fields leading to waterlogging. Then there is the problem of soil salinization. Then we are contaminating our land resources with industrial wastes. We are dumping industrial wastes like say fly ash, heavy metals. All these activities are tremendously impacting the land and obviously the soil resources. So now let us talk about the problem of soil erosion. So soil erosion is practically the loss or the washing away of the top soil. So we are not interested in the entire soil as far as our arability is concerned, as far as cultivability is concerned, but we are chiefly interested in the top soil. That is the first 15 to 20 centimeters of that soil. And this erosion, the problem has become so severe that as of now, one third of the global cropland resources are getting eroded. So, about one third of the global cropland resources are getting eroded. And very surprisingly, out of these total eroded croplands, two-thirds of it lies in Asia and Africa. And remember, Asia and Africa are two continents where huge number of people live. So what we find that around one third of the global croplands are facing the problem of erosion. And out of this one third, two-thirds of it is lying in Asia and Africa. Now, soil erosion, it is mainly of two types. One is the normal or what we call as the geological erosion or the geogenic erosion, and second is the accelerated erosion. So if we are talking of the normal or geological or the geogenic erosion, it is pretty much a natural process. It is the slow and gradual removal of the topsoil by water, by wind, etc. And human beings as a whole cannot interfere or cannot interrupt with this procedure because it's a natural process. It's extremely slow and man does not play any part in it. But we are more concerned with the accelerated erosion. We are more concerned with the accelerated soil erosion where man plays an active role in it. So, accelerated soil erosion is the rapid rate of soil erosion caused due to human activities. Caused due to human activities. And what is the result is that the rate of erosion is much higher than the rate of soil formation. So just as I said, at this present rate, we are eroding our soil resources about 20 to 100 times faster than the renewal rates. We are eroding our soil resources about 20 to 100 times faster than the renewal rates. So the question is, how can we control this soil erosion? So you already know that soil erosion can be caused by natural agents. In that case, we'll be calling it as a natural or geological erosion or geogenic erosion. And the part with which we are bothered is the accelerated erosion, which is brought about by human activities. And the three principal human activities that are responsible for soil erosion are number one, overgrazing, number two, deforestation, and number three, mining activity. Please remember the three major activities or three major anthropogenic activities which are responsible for soil erosion are overgrazing, then you have deforestation, and then you have mining activities, and then you have mining activities. So if we talk of the activity of overgrazing, as you know that with our expanding population there is a massive demand on dairy and dairy related products. At the same time there is a massive demand for meat and cattle products. So obviously globally we find that cattle ranching and dealing with cattle has become a massive global business, and India has the largest cattle population in the world. And because of all these activities, the cattle require grazing ground. So they will be grazing on grasslands, they will be grazing on them. And because there is a huge pressure on these grasslands from the massive cattle population, the grasslands are getting exhausted of their grass resources. And because the cattle, when they eat the grass, they uproot the plant from the soil itself. So there are no grass roots available for holding the soil. And as a result, due to overgrazing, massive areas of grasslands are getting bare. And once these grasslands turn bare, they can be easily eroded by what you can say flowing water, and they can be easily eroded by the blowing wind. So such soils which are suffering from overgrazing, they will also suffer from the problem of erosion. Their productivity will fall, and as a result, this is going to lead to massive crisis, particularly in the cattle sector, in the dairy sector, in the meat production sector, etc. etc. So, this is one aspect of the problem, that is overgrazing. The second aspect is definitely the problem of deforestation. So, as far as deforestation is concerned, we have already discussed about deforestation, which we most correctly call it as the non-selective felling of trees or the non-selective cutting of trees. So, even these forested lands, which are held together by the roots of the trees, and at the same time, these forests act as shelter belts. They reduce the wind velocity, they act as wind breaks. So once we cut down these forests, the roots are no longer available to hold on to the land. The wind breaks, the shelter breaks, they are all destroyed. And as a result, rapidly flowing water, rapidly blowing wind, they will continue to erode the soils, thereby bringing down soil fertility as well as soil productivity. And lastly, a very dangerous activity which causes soil erosion is definitely your mining activity, about which we have again discussed. Mining is carried out to take out the minerals from below the earth's surface. And as I said previously, that mining activity is not at all an environmentally friendly activity, it is an environmentally harmful activity. And so, because of mining, lot of deforestation takes place. The soil becomes bare and barren, and such barren lands are easily susceptible to erosion and thereby turning them into practically desert. So, soil erosion ultimately leads to the loss of soil fertility and productivity, and thereby it triggers another very dangerous process which we call as desertification, which we call as desertification. So desertification is the process of conversion of fertile lands into non-productive wasteland. So a deserted land is particularly a wasteland, but it was not initially a wasteland, it was a fertile land. Because of activities like deforestation, overgrazing, mining and quarrying activities, it leads to the formation of non-productive. That means non-productive both ecologically and non-productive both economically. That is why we call them as desert. So desertification, it leads to the conversion of croplands, rangelands, all into deserts with very low productivity, with very low productivity. So we must remember that activities like deforestation, overgrazing, and your mining and quarrying, it these activities definitely lead to not only soil erosion, it ultimately leads to a very disturbing process which we call as desertification, which we call as desertification. And after this, when we talk about all these activities that soil activities of soil erosion, activities of desertification, etc., etc., then we must also talk of how to protect our soils. We must also talk of how to protect our soils. So now see, whenever we talk of soil conservation, then we must think of afforestation. So, afforestation is a very preliminary requisite for conserving and protecting our soil. And again, remember that you cannot afforest an area with any tree of your choice. You need to afforest with the indigenous trees and plants which used to originally grow there. So afforestation with the indigenous trees and plants which originally is growing there. And then you have to stop deforestation. You have to stop deforestation, and only selective felling of trees has to be allowed. So those trees which are needed industrially, they have to be cut. Otherwise, the trees which are not needed, we cannot clear it. So that means we cannot convert our forests for non-forest purposes. So forests have to be used only for forestry. You cannot convert forest lands into non-forest purposes. Then if you think of that activity of overgrazing, that activity has to be largely regulated. That activity has to be largely regulated. Otherwise, we will lose our grasslands very rapidly. That will again lead to food crisis among the cattle. Then if you think of the modern agricultural procedure, after the Green Revolution, we have developed genetically modified crops which require more water, which require more fertilizers. So we must not over irrigate our fields. Over irrigation also leads to degradation of the soil quality, because due to over irrigation, due to the rapidly flowing water, soil will be blown away. Soil will be flowing away along with that fast flowing water, and at the same time the water will get logged onto the soils, and when that logged water evaporates, the salts will be left back in the soil, leading to soil salinization. So over irrigation has to be stopped. And then if we are thinking of, say, soil fertility and soil health and soil productivity, then we must ensure that the soil microorganisms are able to survive in the soil. Now, this is not possible with the rapid use of modern day synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, because you already know that these synthetic fertilizers and pesticides tremendously kill the soil flora and fauna, leading to disturbance of the soil microecosystem. So we have to gradually change over to organic farming. We have to gradually change over to biofertilizers and biopesticides. Now this changeover to organic farming or biofertilizer and biopesticide cannot occur over a day or over a few months. It will take several years to do so. More investments has to come up in this sector, and more awareness has to be built, because if you go for short term profits, you will ultimately compromise with the quality, with the fertility, and with the productivity of the soil. But if we are planning for a long term sustainable future, then only we will gradually shift to organic farming, and as a result we will be able to retain our soil fertility for long periods of time. Now, after talking about all this, we also need to bring about a change in our irrigation process. Why did I say so? Because, as I said, over irrigation is not at all acceptable. It leads to soil erosion, it leads to water logging, and it leads to soil salinization. So we have to shift over to more scientific procedures of irrigation, like sprinkle irrigations, the sprinkling irrigation. You must have seen water sprinklers present in the agricultural fields and in the gardens. The sprinklers rotate and sprinkle the water. So sprinkle irrigation is a good alternative. Then we can also think of drip irrigation. That is also a good alternative. And also we need to think of crop rotation procedures. You must be knowing about crop rotation, where we do not continuously grow the same crop in that agricultural field, because that crop is going to rob the field of its nutrients. For example, if you are cultivating rice, rice takes up a lot of nitrogen from the soil. So continuous rice cultivation on that same piece of land will make that particular soil nitrogen deficient, leading to fall in the productivity. So what we do, we not only cultivate rice for a season, but in the next season we will cultivate some leguminous crops. So these leguminous crops will help to fix the nitrogen in the soil, and in the process they will retain the nitrogen fertility. So this is also a very important strategy change in the modern agriculture that has to be brought about, along with organic farming and biofertilizers and biopesticides, that we have to regularly practice crop rotation. Apart from that, we also need to discourage any form of shifting cultivation or any form of zoom cultivation, because in the event of or the process of shifting cultivation leads to deforestation. It leads to forming of barren land patches, which are ultimately converted to wastelands with almost zero productivity. So such practices have to be discouraged. So with this, we come to the end of the chapter on resources. So I will just tell you a few questions. You can note it down. So write down. Number one, discuss land as a resource. Discuss land as a resource. Number two, why are the land resources getting degraded? Why are the land resources getting degraded? Number three, number three, what is soil erosion? What is soil erosion? What are the different types of soil erosion? What are the different types of soil erosion? Then discuss the major causes of soil erosion and desertification. Discuss the major causes of soil erosion and desertification. And then suggest some strategies. Suggest some strategies to protect and conserve the soil. Suggest some strategies to protect and conserve the soil. Okay, so these can be either your 5-mark questions or 10-mark questions. And what is soil erosion? That is a short question. Okay, the rest of are all your 5 marks and 10 marks question. Okay. Okay, with that we come to the end of this chapter, that is natural resources. So that is our chapter 2 complete. Next we shall move on to chapter 3, where we will talk about ecosystems. Where we will talk about ecosystems. So write down the name of the next chapter, that is ecosystems. So in this chapter about ecosystems, we will begin our discussion with first with ecology, and then we will talk about your ecosystem. So first we'll talk about ecology, and then we'll talk about ecosystem. Okay, now as far as our chapter is concerned, ecosystems, so let us first begin our discussion with the concept of ecology. Now you already know that this term ecology is actually a combination of two Greek words. This term ecology is actually the combination of two Greek words. And what are these Greek words? Oikos and logos. So the two Greek words are oikos and logos. আচ্ছা লাস্ট কোয়েশ্চেনটা কেউ লিখেছো কি? কেউ যদি লিখে থাকো একটু টাইপ করে দাও না। ইফ someone has written the last question একটু টাইপ করে দাও না। If any one of you has noted down the last question, please type it. Very good. Suggest some strategies to protect and conserve soil. Okay, okay, very good. Okay, thank you. So, going back to our discussion with ecology. So, as I was saying that the word ecology is a combination of two Greek words, and they are oikos, which means home, and logos, which means study. So, ecology is practically the study of the organisms living in their natural homes and interacting with their surroundings. So, ecology is practically the study of living organisms with their environment. So, that is what we mean by the term ecology. So, ecology, remember, it is a combination of two Greek words, that is oikos plus logos. Oikos means home, logos means to study. And what is ecology? How do we define it? It is the study of the interactions of the living organisms with their surroundings or with their environment. So again, remember, the living organisms, they are not only interacting with the living environment, but they are also interacting with the non-living environment. So that means there is a massive interplay of both biotic and abiotic factors during the lifespan of an organism. So it is these interactions of biotic and abiotic factors that keeps an organism alive. And this term ecology, it was coined by the scientist Ernst Haeckel. It was coined by the scientist Ernst Haeckel in 1869. So the term ecology was coined by the scientist Ernst Haeckel in 1869. Now, in the modern days, when we are really advancing in the field of understanding nature, so we are trying to specify some unit of study in the context of ecology. So, one such unit of study in the context of ecology is an ecosystem. So, this term ecosystem practically refers to a unit of study in the context of ecology, and it was coined by the scientist A.G. Tansley in 1935. So the word ecology was coined by Ernst Haeckel in 1869, and the word ecosystem, it was coined by the scientist A.G. Tansley in 1965. So this ecosystem practically refers to a group of several interacting organisms with along with their environment operates as a system. So how can we define ecosystem? An ecosystem is practically a group of interacting organisms with which along with their environment operate as a system. So remember, these ecosystems are practically self-regulating systems. What do they consist of? They consist of group of interacting organisms, which you can also call them as biotic communities, They are in a state of continuous exchange of matter and energy among themselves as well as with their non-living environment. And so, because ecosystems are studying units of ecology, that is why you can also simply say that ecology is the study of ecosystem. Okay, so ecosystem is a group of interacting organisms which along with their environment is operating as a system, Okay, now let us gradually begin to understand the structural features of an ecosystem. Let us gradually begin to understand the structural features of an ecosystem. Now remember, what does an ecosystem consist of? It will consist of several species. So what is a species? A species is an organism or a group of organisms. The species is an organism or a group of organisms which interact with one another to produce which interact with one another and interbreed to produce fertile offsprings. So species are a group of interacting organisms which interbreed among themselves to produce fertile offsprings. And when different types of species live together in a particular region, we call it as a community. When different kinds of species live in a particular region, we call it as a community. So ecosystem consists of plant communities, animal communities, microbial communities, and all these interacting communities are not only interacting among themselves, but they are also interacting with their non-living environment. So obviously, if we begin to analyze the structure of the ecosystem structure will consist of both living as well as non-living components. So if I say the living components, the living components will be very aptly referred as your biotic components, and the non-living components will be aptly referred as the abiotic components. So if I am talking of these biotic components, you can further classify them as producers, consumers, and decomposers. Now these producers, they are primarily concerned with the production of their food either by the process of photosynthesis, that is fixing of carbon utilizing light as an energy, or by the process of chemosynthesis, that is by the process of chemosynthesis whereby food is prepared by utilizing certain chemicals. So those who prepare their food using light, they are called photoautotrophs, and those who prepare their food by depending on certain chemical reactions, say certain bacteria, they are called as chemoautotrophs. But both are autotrophs. Auto means self, troph means nourishing. So producers who can produce their own food, who can fix carbon, they are of two types, namely phototrophic and chemotrophic, or photoautotrophic or chemoautotrophic. Now coming down to these consumers. Now the consumers, they are not biologically evolved to prepare their food, but they are biologically evolved to gather their food. And these consumers may be your herbivores, they may be your carnivores, they may be omnivores, or they may be detritivores. So consumers are of four basic types: herbivores, feeding on the plants; carnivores, feeding on other animals, which includes herbivores. Then you have omnivores, which includes organisms like human beings and bear. Omnivores feed on both plants and animals. And then you have detritivores. Now these detritivores, they feed upon detritus, that is dead and decaying organic matter, dead and decaying tissues. So they are called as detritivores. So consumers are of four types: herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, detritivore. And then comes your decomposers, which chiefly include the bacteria and funguses. And what is their function? Their main function is to decompose the dead bodies of the various plants and animals and to recycle the nutrients back to the environment. So in the ecosystem structure, we got both biotic as well as abiotic components. I was discussing about the biotic component. Biotic components divided into producers, consumers, decomposers. Producers, I classified them as phototrophic and chemotrophic. Consumers, I classified them as herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and your detritivores. And lastly came your decomposers. So after talking about the biotic components or the living components of the ecosystem, the next thing about which we can definitely talk are the abiotic or the non-living components. So these abiotic components, I can divide them into physical components as well as chemical components. So if I am talking of the physical components or the physical factors, I can further classify them into climatic factors, edaphic factors, and geographic factors. So the physical factors, they are further classified as your climatic factors, edaphic factors, and geographic factors. So what do these climatic factors include? So the climatic factors will include your say sunlight, temperature, rainfall, humidity, etc. Edaphic chiefly refers to the factors related to soil, like soil moisture, soil types, soil texture, etc. And then comes the geographic factors, which will include, say, altitude, height of a place, or the latitudinal location of a place, or the longitudinal location of a place, etc. So the abiotic factors, we are dividing them into physical and chemical factors. What does physical factors include? It includes climatic factors, edaphic factors, geographic factors. Climatic factors will include sunlight, temperature, moisture, etc., wind, rainfall. Edaphic factors will be the factors related to soil, soil temperature, soil moisture, soil fertility, soil type, etc. And the geographic factors will include, say, altitude of the place, height of the place, or the latitudinal locations or the longitudinal locations, etc. Then comes your chemical factors, which are also pretty much an intimate part of an ecosystem structure, which includes your major nutrients which we require, say like nitrogen. Then you have trace nutrients which we require, say like molybdenum or say like copper, which are required in trace amounts. Then modern day ecosystems cannot be pollution free, so pollutants are pretty much a part of the chemical environment of the ecosystem. And lastly, there are several organic substances in the ecosystem, in the chemical part of the ecosystem, like proteins, like fats, like vitamins, etc., etc. So the abiotic part, you are dividing it into physical and chemical factor. Physical factors include climatic, edaphic, geographic factors. Chemical factors include major nutrients, trace nutrients, pollutants, and organic substances. Okay? So proceed further, before I proceed further, we will be taking down a few questions. We will be taking down a few questions. So write down. So write down. Number one, define ecology. Define ecology. It may be a 1 mark or a 2 mark question. Number two, who coined the term ecology? Who coined the term ecology? This is also a 1 mark question. Then name the Greek words. Name the Greek words from which the word ecology has been derived. Name the Greek words from which the word ecology has been derived. Okay? This is also a 1 mark question. Next, write down, what is an ecosystem? What is an ecosystem? Next, who coined the term ecosystem? Who coined the term ecosystem? These are again, as I said, 1 mark questions. Then write a note, write a note on ecosystem structure. Write a note on ecosystem structure. Write a note on ecosystem structure. Okay. Now, after talking about ecosystem structure, next we will begin our discussion with ecosystem function. Next we will begin our discussion with ecosystem function. Now, we can understand that there is pretty much an interactive relationship between the biotic and abiotic components of the ecosystem. So no component can survive without the other. So these two components are practically complementing each other. One cannot exist without the other. So every ecosystem on this planet, if you think of, it is performing under some kind of a naturally existing condition. So obviously, if these ecosystems are performing under naturally existing conditions, I am talking about natural ecosystems, not man-made. Man-made ecosystems are there, say for example a cropland or an aquarium. These are all examples of man-made ecosystems where there are human manipulations, planned human interventions, etc. But if you think of the natural ecosystem, say you're a pond or a grassland or a tropical forest, etc., these are natural ecosystems which are subsidized by nature. And in man-made ecosystems like an aquarium or a cropland, these are all subsidized by man. So if we are talking of these natural ecosystems, they chiefly receive the energy from the sun, and then they pass down this energy through the various components. So if we think of the major functional attributes of the ecosystem, this will chiefly include, say, the food chains and food webs and trophic structure of the ecosystem. Then a very important functional attribute of the ecosystem is the energy flowing through the ecosystem. Then every ecosystem is characterized by the cycling of nutrients, and then every ecosystem has primary and secondary production, and obviously every ecosystem undergoes the process of development and regulation, which we call as ecological succession, so the various functional attributes of the ecosystem include: number 1, food chains, food webs and trophic structure; number 2, energy flow; number 3, nutrient cycling; number 4, primary and secondary production; number 5, ecosystem development and regulation, which we also call as ecological succession, Now, let us gradually begin our discussion with the various functional aspects of the ecosystem, starting with food chains. So, before I begin, just write down a question. What are the major functional attributes what are the major functional attributes of an ecosystem? What are the major functional attributes of an ecosystem? So just now I said them. So you will be writing down that. What are the major attributes of the functional ecosystem? So you will be able to write down that answer. Now see, let us begin with a food chain. Now you all know that it is impossible for an organism to survive without food. So either you have to be a food producer or you have to be a food gatherer. So that depends on the type of evolution the organism has underwent. So every food chain in an ecosystem is practically a linear sequence which is characterized by repeated eating and being eaten. So I'm repeating, every food chain in an ecosystem is practically a linear representation or a linear arrangement of organisms which is characterized by repeated eating and being eaten. So if I talk of a very simple type of food chain which we all have studied from our lower classes, say a food chain of the grassland ecosystem, say grass, grasshopper, frog, snake, and hawk. So I'm repeating the food chain: grass, grasshopper, frog, snake, and hawk. So the grass is the producer, the grasshopper, frog, snake, hawk, they are all consumers. But the grass, I mean to say the grasshopper is your primary consumer, frog is the secondary consumer, snake is the tertiary consumer, and the hawk is the quaternary consumer. So that means these ecosystems, they are primary, I mean to say these food chains, they are primarily beginning with a producer component, and from the producer they move on to the consumer component. They move on to the consumer component. Now, as this food chain progresses, as one organism eats the other, actually there is a continuous flow of matter and energy. There is a continuous flow of matter and energy. And each of these food levels, that is the producer level, primary consumer level, secondary consumer level, tertiary consumer level, etc., each of these food levels, these are known as the trophic levels. They are known as the trophic levels. And the amount of living matter present in these trophic levels is also referred to as the standing crop. It is also referred to as the standing crop. So each of these food levels, they are called as the trophic levels, and the amount of what you can say living matter present in these food levels or trophic levels is also called as the standing crop, and the amount of non-living matter present at any given time in an ecosystem will be called as the standing state. And whenever we express the standing crop in terms of weight, that is what is called as the biomass. So what is biomass? Biomass is often defined as the standing crop in terms of weight. So that's okay. After discussing about standing crop, standing state, trophic level, etc., now we shall be discussing two basic types of food chains, that is the grazing food chain and the detritus food chain. That is the grazing food chain and the detritus food chain. Now, as far as the grazing food chain is concerned, whose example I gave you during a grassland ecosystem, in the case of a grassland ecosystem, that is grass, grasshopper, then you have your frog, snake, hawk. So all grazing food chains begin with a producer component, and from the producer component the energy gradually flows to the consumer components. And very importantly, these grazing food chains are directly dependent on the solar influx. These grazing food chains are directly dependent on the solar influx. Now, say for example, if you think of a pond ecosystem, there also we can take an example of a grazing food chain, say the phytoplanktons in a pond, which consist of algae, which are the producers. So these phytoplanktons are consumed by the zooplanktons. They are the primary consumers. The zooplanktons are consumed by the small fish. So the small fish are the secondary consumers, and the small fish are consumed by the large carnivorous fishes. They become the tertiary consumers. And if man in turn consumes these carnivorous fishes, then we become the quaternary consumer. So the key aspect is every grazing food chain begins with a producer component, then proceeds from the producer onto the consumers, and they are directly dependent on the solar influx. They are directly dependent on the solar influx. Then comes the detritus food chain. So detritus means, as I said, you can call it as a dead and decomposing organic matter or tissue, which may be of plant origin or which may be of animal origin. So these detritus food chains, it practically begins with dead and decaying organic matter. Say for example, leaf litter, fallen leaves in a forest. So these fallen leaves in a forest, they are maybe being consumed by some insects. So the fallen leaves are the detritus. The insects which consume these fallen leaves, they are the detritivores. They are the detritivores. That is those organisms who are consuming the detritus. And say certain birds come and feed upon these insects who were consuming these fallen leaves, then these birds become your secondary consumers. So in the detritus food chain, it does not begin with a producer. The detritus food chain does not depend on direct solar influx. It begins directly with dead and decomposing organic matter, that is detritus. From the detritus, it moves on to the detritivore. From the detritivore, it moves on to the carnivores which feed on the detritivores. So these are some of the what you can say basic difference between a grazing and a detritus food chain. So just write down a question before I end today's class. Write down. Define define number one, trophic level. Number two, food chain. Number two, food chain. Next, write down differentiate between a grazing food chain and a detritus food chain. Differentiate between a grazing food chain and a detritus food chain. GFC and DFC. Grazing food chain and a detritus food chain. Okay. Okay, so with that we come to the end of today's class. In the next class we shall again continue with ecosystems. We'll move into food webs, then you have ecological pyramids, and then energy flow through the ecosystem, and then we will talk about biogeochemical cycles. Then you have ecosystem productivity, then you have to learn about major ecosystems. ডিএফসি হচ্ছে ডেট্রিটাস ফুড চেন। ডেট্রিটাস ফুড চেন কি বললাম, যে ফুড চেনটা তোমার ডেট্রিটাস দিয়ে শুরু হয়, ডেট্রিটাস থেকে চলে যাবে টু ডেট্রিটিভোর্স, ডেট্রিটিভোর্স থেকে চলে যাবে টু দ্য কার্নিভোর্স অফ দ্য ডেট্রিটিভোর্স। এবং ডেট্রিটাস ফুড চেন কিন্তু ডাইরেক্টলি সোলার ইনফ্লাক্সের ওপর ডিপেন্ড করে না, যেটা গ্রেজিং ফুড চেন করে। ঠিক আছে, ওকে। সো উইথ দ্যাট উই কাম টু দ্য এন্ড অফ টুডেজ ক্লাস। একটু পরেই আমি ক্লাসের ভিডিওটা ইউটিউবে আপলোড করে দেবো। যারা দেখোনি বা আরেকবার ক্লাসটা শুনতে চাও তারা ওখান থেকে শুনে নিও। হ্যাঁ, বন্ধুদের সঙ্গে একটু শেয়ার করে দেবে। ইউটিউবের লিঙ্ক নিশ্চয়ই সবার কাছে আছে। এই ইএনভিএস এর সিলেবাস তো দিয়ে দিয়েছি ফার্স্ট ক্লাসে, কোনো একটা বন্ধুর কাছ থেকে চেয়ে নাও। ফার্স্ট ক্লাসেই আমি দিয়ে দিয়েছি ইএনভিএস এর সিলেবাস। হ্যাঁ, ওকে, চলো বাই দেন।